welcome back to chapter 1. Today we'll be finishing the chapter with continuation from the comparison between primary growth and secondary growth in eudicots, and then we'll move directly to 1.3 afterwards. Right, so before this we were talking about the exact or the specifics of primary growth and secondary growth and the different types of tissues that are involved, and we are just going to be going through the similarities and differences between the two growth, right? So here is just a reminder of where the apical meristems are in the shoots and in the roots, and then you have your lateral meristem, which is just a cross section of a stem. Right, so the similarities between the primary and the secondary growth would be, of course, to increase the size of the plants permanently, because it's growth, and we've mentioned before, it's irreversible change, so we want the size to increase permanently. And then both growths occur in woody plants and also involve cell division by mitosis. Pretty simple stuff for similarities. And then in terms of differences, here is where you get a little bit more in depth, right? So for the meristem involved, you have your apical for your primary, so a vertical increase in length. And then secondary growth would be lateral meristem, which involves the vascular cambium and the court cambium. So just remember, lateral meristem, you have your vascular, your xylem, and your phloem, and then you have your court cambium, which is the matured cells that have formed on the outermost surface or outermost layer of the stem. Okay. And then moving on to the parts of plants. In primary growth, it would involve both stems and roots in the younger regions of the plants, because those are the areas where the cell division is the most active, apical. And then in secondary growth is where the primary growth has ceased. Okay, so on matured stems and roots. So for secondary growth to start, the plant itself has a mechanism where it sort of detects the primary growth has stopped, so it starts on the secondary growth. Okay, direction of growth, longitudinally or vertical, and radially or horizontal. Okay, we're done with that. And growth effects for primary growth leads to the increase of length, okay, both stems and roots, don't forget the roots. And then for secondary growth, it increases the thickness or circumference of both stems and roots as well. So the reason why a lot of the examples that have been given were mostly stems and a small section on the roots is because it's easier to talk about it in the stems because it is bigger. So in terms of roots, it's mostly to make sure that the roots stay strong and basically, to make sure that the length, because it usually just keeps growing in terms of length to find water in the soil, right? So it needs to have the strength through the thickness or the big circumference of its roots to make sure that it doesn't snap halfway as it grows longer and longer to find a source of water in the soil. Okay, so roots. And then we have tissues and structures formed. We start with the primary growth. We have your epidermis, or the skin of the plant, so to speak. And then we have cortex and primary vascular tissues. Whereas in the secondary, you have your bark, which is your matured and dead cells, basically. Okay, and you have your periderm, your lenticles, and secondary vascular tissues. So like in 1.2 we talk about the differences between the primary xylem and the secondary xylem, and where they push towards where to initiate and continue secondary growth. So those are the differences between the tissues that are involved and formed in both growth. Okay, and then the presence of woody tissues in secondary growth there is, but it is not present in primary growth. Then we go to the thickness of bark. We have thin in primary growth and we have thick in secondary growth. And lastly, presence of animal rings. You don't have it in primary growth because the growth is vertical or longitudinal, and it is quite fast compared to secondary growth. So there is no time for like remember the example between the growth rings, like the summer and the spring that we've covered before. So because of the speed of primary growth, there isn't a chance for annual rings to form even, right? And there is no pressure in terms of the growth. Like in secondary growth, there's pressure between the secondary and the xylem pushing each other to increase the circumference, to increase the thickness of stems and roots, which is why it is present in secondary growth. Okay, annual growth rings. So those are the similarities and the differences between primary and secondary growth, and then we'll jump right into the economic importance of plants that have undergone secondary growth. We'll go back to bioexploration before we finish 1.2 later on. Okay, so with secondary growth, there is a high economic value because we have timber. So timber is used in a lot of art, in construction, and so on. So the first one is have strong and hard woods, which are suitable to be used as structures. So we have your houseboats, we have your boats, we have your furniture, fences, doors, and so on. Kayu belian, right? Kayu belian or pokok belian is the number one most precious tree, wood, strong, very strong wood in Sarawak especially, because of this secondary growth. Okay, the thickness of the pokok belian is I guess that's where the strength of the wood comes from. Okay, so the presence of annual rings makes furniture look attractive, can be made as decorative items. I think you've seen a lot of those arts where they actually paint the annual rings on. So in natural wood, when the how to say secondary growth has made really obvious annual rings, it is actually kept as a design for the furniture or for the art because it has an appeal, you know, it is attractive looking. Okay, then we go to the third point, which is the woods and barks of some plants can produce resin and oil. So this can be commercialized as varnish, adhesive substances, perfume, and medicine. So you also have kayu gaharu, it's perfume, right? Flowering plants can be made as decorative plants, as usual. And lastly, commercial fruits such as mangoes and mangosteens are products of plants that have undergone secondary growth, and they are able to generate income as well as boost economic growth. So this is more towards fruit yield. With secondary growth, it supports the plant itself to grow tall and to produce a lot of fruits whenever season is in. So it is a high economic value. So we come back to bioexploration, right? So flowering plants, i.e. angiosperms, can be classified into monocotyledons and eudicotyledons. So both of them, like, yeah, it's how to say, it is applicable to be under both classification. However, they do differ in terms of pollen structure, of course, the number of cotyledons, type of root, leaf venation, and vascular bundle arrangement. So eudicots are the largest group in flowering plants, various species where some can undergo secondary growth, allowing them to grow tall and live for hundreds of years. So that's why I think I've mentioned it before early on, between primary and secondary growth, where most of secondary growth, where most of eudicots go through secondary growth. Now grow tall and live for 100 years. Yeah, so that is 1.2. Then here are a few questions that you can answer to revise on what you have known. Okay. Then we go to growth curves. This is the last subtopic of the chapter. So different plants have different life cycles, namely annual, biennial, and perennial plants. So we'll start off with the annual plants. So annual, as you can see and understand from the name, it means every year. So it grows for 1 year and it dies, basically. Okay. They only have one life cycle for a season or a year. So it doesn't really have to be a year. It can only be a few months due to, it being seasonal. But they usually die after completing their biological cycle. Okay, so biological cycle starts from germination and then ends with flowering or producing seeds. Okay, so examples would be your paddy, and then your pumpkin, and your watermelon. So I guess in a way, for you to remember easily, I think some of you would be familiar with paddy planting, where your family or the people in your village, they have to grow paddy. Like once they harvest it, they have to regrow it again because it doesn't grow from the old plants. Like once the paddy is mature, you harvest it, that's the end of it. It dies because not of outside causes. It's natural. The life cycle is just within that one time. Okay, so paddy. So it's the same for both pumpkin and watermelon. Then we have biennial plants. So biennial plants refer to plants which takes 2 years with 2 seasons of growth to complete life cycle. So by 2, okay? Excuse me. So the first growth season is the vegetative growth, which is growth of roots. You have your roots, leaves, and stem structures. And then the second growth is reproduction. So most of these actually grow in temperate regions. So temperate regions, places with season, 4 season. Okay. So again, repeating the first round, the first growth of biennial plants is vegetative growth. So your roots, your leaves, and your stems. And then the second part is the reproduction. Right? So the second part is actually really important, of course, to make sure that when it dies, there is another generation of plants to continue the lineage of that species. Okay, so after going through vegetative growth, these plants briefly stop the growth process during winter. So, which is why they grow in temperate regions. The winter helps in terms of pausing. Okay, briefly stops, pausing the growth process. And then when spring and summer comes around, the growth continues as a preparation to flower. Okay, during spring and summer. Preparation for reproduction by flowering. So the plants produce fruits and seeds, and eventually it will die. So that's the end of the life cycle. So examples of the biennial plants include cabbage, carrot, and silver cockscomb. So the silver cockscomb is more of a flower. Okay. And then the other two is vegetable. Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it for biennial plants. And then lastly, we have your perennial plants. So perennial plants is the longest the longest life cycle of plants. They live more than 2 years. So 2 years is the cut off because we have annual, of course, 1 year, and then biennial. which is 2 years. And then you have your 2 years and above kind of growth, which is your perennial plants. So they have a longer lifespan depending on the species and conditions. It can last for probably 5 to 10 years. Some even last 100 years. So perennial plants can be classified into two categories. Okay, so two is woody plants and herbaceous plants. Okay, perennial. Okay, let me just draw it. Okay. So you have your perennial plants, and then it branch off into two, which is your woody, and then you have your herbaceous. Okay, we have a branching going on here. So most of these are able to flower. So they are flowering plants, most of it, and bear fruits many times throughout their lives. So when you have a tree, right, for example, a fruit tree, and it's planted one time, and then you hear, oh, it's in season, it's flowering, and then it's bearing fruit, but then you don't need to cut it off because it's still alive for the next year, and the next year it goes for about 5, maybe 8, sometimes even longer than that. You have your if I remember correctly, a few weeks ago, there was this a few 100-year-old durian tree somewhere in Pahang or something, I'm not sure. So that is a perennial plant. You don't have to plant it every year, because you plant it once, it grows, it matures, flowers, bear fruits, and then it stops, pauses, and then a few months later it flowers again, bears fruit, and then stops, it's still alive. Another year you have your flowers, bear fruits, so on and so forth. You get the concept, right? So they have structures that are adaptable to their surroundings and temperature change. So for example, you have your grass, you have your hibiscus plant and mango plant. Okay, so annual, biennial, and perennial. And then we have to remember the growth curve. This is a bit a bit complicated in terms of the specifics of the stages, but if you remember how the life cycle is, as in like where does it start, what happens in the middle, and how it ends, you can easily like what's that word, identify the growth curve for each type of life cycle. Okay, so for the first one, if the growth curve is a sigmoid curve, it is an annual plant. Okay, it starts off with decreasing of dry mass, and the reason for this is because we have energy usage for germination. Okay, for the leaves emerge, for photosynthesis. So we have a slight decrease in dry mass first, and then you have your increase in dry mass. So this increase means the rapid growth. Okay, the rapid growth, and then you actually have a short phase of constant growth right before the dying stage comes into, because the plant has matured. Okay, and then lastly, you have a decrease in dry mass, and this is quite slow. Aging, lower rate of photosynthesis, a shedding of leaves and flowers, and seed dispersal. So seed dispersal actually takes up a lot of energy. So a lot of the plant's being, I guess, is being used up, and you have your decrease in dry mass. So it's quite fast. You know, you have your constant and long growth, and then when the time comes, it is steep, like steep going down the hill. Okay, for animal. And then we have biennial plants. So biennial plants, you have a bit of a two sigmoid curves. So the first one is like this, and then the one for the second half of the life cycle. So the first growth season, of course, your germination, which is why you have a slight small dip right here. Okay, as you can see, it does dip a bit. So germination, and then it immediately goes to produce leaves, photosynthesis, and then you have the energy or food for the plants stored in the tubers, And then the second growth season, the food store is used to produce flowers and seed, which is why it's sort of like a slow dip, because the storage is being used up. It's not a straight up first and then dip. It's just up a bit and then dip a bit, kind of thing. Okay, second growth season. And then lastly, the easiest one to identify is the growth curve of a perennial plant, where it's just a constant growth. Okay. However, that's just the what is it called? The line of best curve, I think, if I remember that correctly, because the growth curve is actually just a series of small curves. Okay. So if you see a question, in your test, your quiz or exams, and it shows like a series of small sigmoid curves like this, okay, but there's no line of best curve, it is still the growth curve of a perennial plant, because you know that it is a series of small sigmoid growth, as you can see here. Okay, and you can also see that the difference between the annual biennial plants and the perennial plants, the time phases is in weeks for the other two, and then for perennial plants it's year. Okay, so every year the growth curve is a sigmoid curve. So basically for perennial plants, this is just a dense of annual sigmoid curve growth. Okay, and it occurs throughout the lifespan of the plant. So the rate of growth is actually high during spring and summer, because you have ample sunlight for photosynthesis, and then the rate of growth decreases during winter because it's cold and there's not a lot of sun. Okay, so that's the 3 different types of growth curves, respectively, with each type of life cycle of plants. Okay, and we have, I guess, the experiment that you could have done, I'm not sure, that is to further understand the plotting of a growth curve. Sorry. And then lastly, you complete with a formative practice just to revise and retest your understanding of the subtopic plant growth curves. Okay, so here is a memory flashback of what we have covered in the last 2 videos. And this video, we went in with the organization of tissues first. We learned about the different tissues in a plant, and then going on with meristematic tissues and growth, which is the primary and secondary growth, and then the different types of tissues involved in it, the different types of zones in the growth of each tissue. Okay, and then lastly, we have just covered the growth curves, types of plants based on their life cycles, and the different types of growth curve. So that is the end of chapter 1. Thank you, and we'll move to chapter 2 soon.